This is Rick Malone for the San Francisco Symphony. It's tempting to think of Mahler's Symphony No. 9 as his farewell statement. He wrote it during a very difficult period in his life. It's full of farewell gestures and references to other farewell works, and it was also Mahler himself who first spoke of a curse of the Ninth Symphony. As Schoenberg later put it, those who have written a ninth stood too close to the hereafter. But the fact remains that despite his general depression at the time, Mahler was so buoyed by completing his Ninth Symphony that he immediately began working on his 10th, and had completed a good deal of it before dying of a blood infection 7 weeks before his 51st birthday. "1907 was a momentous year for Mahler, and it was the beginning of the last chapter of his too short life. It began with his resignation from the post of artistic director of the Vienna Court Opera, after 10 years of artistic battles, occasional triumphs, and endless struggles against the entrenched anti-Semitism of the Viennese musical establishment. Within weeks, though, he had signed a contract with the Metropolitan Opera in New York, a tenure that would also be legendary. Just 1 month later, though, his 4-year-old daughter Maria died of scarlet fever and diphtheria, and only days after her funeral, Mahler's doctors gave him the details of the heart condition that would hasten his death, and advised him to curtail all physical activities. For Mahler, who was an enthusiastic hiker, cyclist, and swimmer, this would have been almost a death sentence in and of itself. Still, what happened from 1907 until 1911 is not the story of an invalid. During this period, Mahler gave concerts throughout Europe, assumed directorship of the New York Philharmonic, and composed his symphony without a number, Das Lied von der Erde. And these are simply highlights of those years. Clearly, he was far from ready to make his own farewells. The Ninth was the last of Mahler's completed scores to be presented to the public. It premiered just about a year after his death. It was a bit of a surprise, since he was returning to the classic 4-movement structure for the first time since his Symphony No. 6. Mahler expert Derek Cook has proposed that the composer was paying tribute to the 6th and final symphony by Tchaikovsky, which was less than 2 decades old, and which Mahler had conducted several times. There are clear structural parallels between each symphony's movements, not to mention the parallel added by fate. Each one was its composer's inadvertent farewell to work and to life. The first movement of Mahler's Ninth is all about transitions. And again, one could read into it the looming and ever-present transition between life and death. Mahler created a new universe with every symphony, and the Ninth begins with cellos and horn emerging from the void with a halting, irregular rhythm. Leonard Bernstein suggested that this was Mahler's own damaged heartbeat. The bells toll in the lower register of the harp, and the strings sweep in with a long, yearning melody that becomes a duet with the horn. Mahler's transitions are almost magical. A look at the score will tell you just how much effort went into making them seem spontaneous. And the transitions are in two dimensions, horizontal as the melody proceeds from one event to the next, and vertical in the integration of the melodic strands and their accompaniments. That long opening melody keeps returning, always with new details of shape and texture. The most persistent element of contrast comes in a stormy, passionate theme in minor mode. It sounds like new material, but it's really built out of intervals, rhythms, and accompaniments that we heard earlier. The faltering pulse and the harp tollings persist. Dramatic abruptions shatter the seamless continuities. Urgent trumpet signals mark towering climaxes. After each climax, Mahler returns to some variation of the falling theme that he established at the beginning of the movement. In his sketches, he marked these sections Lebewohl, or farewell. It's his tribute to Beethoven, whose Piano Sonata No. 26, the Farewell Sonata, begins with exactly this pattern. Mahler's critics never got over his use of folk song and dance elements. The rhythm of the transitions from climax to climax and from expansion to contraction were foreshadowed by the irregular pulse that began the symphony. The march returns, growing more and more impassioned. Suddenly, the music plunges into the quietest and slowest section we have heard so far. And the movement concludes with a delicate series of duets, trios, and quartets spread throughout the orchestra. The space between events grows wider and wider until at last silence wins out over sound. The second movement returns us forcefully to earth. Mahler's fond memories of the folk dances he heard in his youth always figure prominently in his symphonies, and here he gives us three varieties. A Ländler, or couple dance in three-quarter time, which Mahler calls leisurely, clumsy, heavy-footed, coarse. Then something quicker and more waltz-like. This section was appropriated almost whole by Shostakovich for his Fifth Symphony. And finally, another Ländler, lilting and sentimental. This movement is all about transitions as well. This movement also finishes with a disintegrating coda, but rather than falling apart in despair, it's one of Mahler's musical jokes, an intriguing mixture of the ghostly and the cute. Where the second movement was expansive and leisurely, the third is music of violent urgency. Mahler calls it a burlesque and wants it played very defiantly. He opens by hurling 3 distinct motifs at us that begin to weave together in a counterpoint. Mahler shows off his skill at writing a fugue, and throughout, he throws in reminders of themes we've heard in earlier Mahler symphonies. A contrasting trio brings a more leisurely march and a relief from the high anxiety. One of the most touching transitions in the whole symphony is this trumpet entrance, transforming one of the burlesque's most jagged themes into a warm and tender melody. But before long, the fierce music returns, bringing this movement to its crashing final cadence. Now Mahler builds an adagio to balance and, in a way, complete the first movement. He begins with a great cry of violins. The strings, directed to play with big tone, all join in a richly textured hymn. Their song is interrupted by a quiet, virtually unaccompanied phrase of a single bassoon. The passionate string theme comes right back, and suddenly we're in a collision of worlds. Tender and reverent alternate with ghostly and hollow, very high and very low. As the two musics alternate, the hymnic song becomes more intense and urgent each time it returns. There are echoes of Das Lied von der Erde and phrases from the burlesque. Finally, this movement begins to melt away as well. All instruments but the strings fall silent. The cellos sing a phrase which they can scarcely bear to let go. Then, after a great stillness, the music seems to draw breath and begin again, even slower than before, and pianissimo to the end. Two years before his daughter Maria died, Mahler had, in the words of his wife, tempted fate by writing his Kindertotenlieder, Laments on the Deaths of Children. When Mahler quotes Der Tag ist schön auf jenen Höhen, the day is so lovely on those heights, his biographer Michael Kennedy asks, might this not be his requiem for his daughter and for his long-dead brothers and sisters? The music recedes, grief gives way to peace, music and silence become one. The dark part of Mahler, who was suspicious about Ninth Symphonies, would have wanted this to be his final farewell. But there was the side of him that, despite his fascination with death, always caused him to choose life. This was the Mahler who was more interested in writing music than in flirting with superstitions. The Mahler who once told Sibelius that a symphony must be like the world, it must embrace everything. Mahler embraced life, even in the face of death, but in his Ninth Symphony, he managed to express just how thin that line actually is. This is Rick Malone for the San Francisco Symphony.